from the Vertical, their front office insider, Bobby Marks. He's a 20-year executive with the Nets and has a behind-the-scenes look at everything that's going on. Very busy time, Bobby. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys.
You got it. What is this week like when you're up in the front office right now, specifically if you're a team that is in the top half of this draft and have a lot of assets? You know, we're here in the Philly market where they've got a ton of stuff. I'm assuming Colangelo's phone is probably going nonstop.
Yeah, I mean, this process has been going on for the last, couple of months. It really ramps up, over this past weekend where you start setting your board, you start getting your options in place as far as from a trade standpoint. You've got to get all your paperwork in order. So when you get into the draft tomorrow night, you just don't want any surprises, and you want to be prepared. So, when you're looking at Philly, they've got a lot of ways to go. The likelihood is, as we heard yesterday, Ben Simmons at number one, and then we have to figure out, can you get another pick into that, into the lottery, and what would it cost you to do so? And you have the back end with, the pick in the 20s also. So tons of flexibility here for Philadelphia, but it's just one piece. We'll see what happens also in free agency with all the, the cap room they have too.
Bobby, if you're Brian Colangelo right now, is Ben Simmons the no-brainer pick for you?
I think he is. I know his year was up and down and everything, and I'm a big fan of, players who are kind of, I guess you say, positionless, and I think that's what Simmons is. He can do a lot of good things. I know the knock on him is that we haven't seen, from a shooting standpoint, that's kind of been the knock a little bit, but he's 6'10", 240, can play probably all positions, especially in this day and age. You can give him the ball if you want and everything, and he's still young enough where there's a ton of upside there. I like Ingram also, but my concern with him is he's 6'9", 196 pounds and everything. Can you add some and I understand Durant was like that when he came out of Texas but can you add some weight there? So I if you're asking me Simmons or Ingram, I'm going to say Simmons.
Bobby Marks is with us from the Vertical. And, Bobby, what kind of discussions do teams have when there are two guys like this draft has, Ingram and Simmons? How do they go back and forth on those guys?
Well, you really got to rely on your scouts and everything, because you're not going to get these kids in for draft workouts. I know Philadelphia had Simmons in, but basically he's coming in really to get a comfort level with your coaches and everything, and he's not working out against anybody, so it's 1-0. So it's hard to get a gauge off that. So you've got to rely on your personnel scouts, your background that you've done on him at LSU, your medical, your psych. It's a kind of a big process as far as putting that all together and everything. And, but sometimes it's gut. I mean, I hate to say it and everything, but just to feel as far as how that player can kind of fit in and what piece is he going forward.
So you write this great article, Front Office Insider Draft Week, about setting the board. Maybe explain to us what goes into that kind of stuff about ranking guys, and is that how that process works?
Yeah, so what you want to do is you need to get some structure when you get into draft week, and you set the board and you put your best, 1 to 60 up there. Usually your personnel department does that as far as your director of scouting, and you do it on best available only. And then towards, the week and everything, you start moving guys around based on, red flags, medical-wise, what kind of information you get from your psych and your psych reports and everything, any additional information you might have and everything, and then you have some really internal discussions when you start breaking down guys in groups and everything, and I guess the term is you start massaging the board and everything. So when you get into the night of the draft, you don't want any surprises. You don't want to, all of a sudden decide, that the ninth best player should be picked at 2 or 3 and everything. So you have some structure there. It gets a little bit challenging with teams with multiple picks. If you're Philadelphia and if you were to pick, let's say, a point guard at 1, which I know they won't do, the likelihood of them picking a point guard at 24 or 26 would be rare. So that's where you really got to rely on your scouts for that.
So in a team like Philadelphia's case, with the state of their current roster, do you take for fit? Do you take for need? Do you take best available?
Well, I think when you get to, I think for the first pick, you do it best available. And then what's going to happen tomorrow night, you will see, is that there is a large group of guys, I'd say 15 to 20 of them, that are lumped up together and everything. So there's not much separation. So when you get into the 20s, if Philadelphia still has their pick, you can draft more on need if that's the direction you want to go. There's not much separation there. And I've said all along, this is going to be the draft that we're going to see. We look back on this 3 or 4 years from now, and we'll determine kind of what scouting departments really stood out based on so little separation between all these players here.
Bobby Marks from The Vertical here, former front office executive in the NBA, 20 years with the Nets. And, Philadelphia's got a lot going on. So you agree with Simmons, but now they're in a spot where, as Pete kind of mentioned, they've got an interesting roster makeup with so many big men. So if you're in Brian Colangelo's shoes, are you working the phones to try to break up that trio of Okafor, Noel, Embiid to get yourself back in that top 5?
I'm not right now, just because I'm not sure what, as far as with the Embiid health going forward. If he had given me a full year and everything, then I would I'd likely look towards trying to break up that group. But what's to say if you move a guy like Okafor or Noel and Embiid comes back and has another setback, and now you're working from a weakness instead of a strength and everything. So I'd like to see what Embiid can do this summer, if he can stay healthy, if he does play summer league and everything, and kind of go from there. But I'm not jumping the gun to try to move one of those, if you can get back into the lottery and everything.
All right. If you had to choose, and I'm assuming Embiid would be off the table for Philadelphia, are you keeping Noel or are you keeping Okafor?
You know what? I'll say I'm going to keep Okafor just because he's got less years on his contract. Noel, you go into, he'll be going into his final year. You can offer, an extension if you want to and everything. So, if you're asking me, Okafor, I do like Noel and everything, especially if you're going to play a style where you're going to get, go up and down and everything. So, it's a tough choice.
That's funny because you answered that, Bobby, with a front office perspective, because the first thing you said was he's got less years on the contract.
I know that's how I was looking at it and everything. So, but hopefully Philadelphia doesn't have to make that choice. The interesting play would be how valuable they deem that Laker pick. And would a scenario present tomorrow night, and how the front office there would react if they can get into, let's say, 4, 5 by dangling, that pick to do so, and if they would do so, because next year could be potentially a loaded draft, and the Lakers will likely give that pick to Philly. And I just don't want, Philly thinking about the short term instead of the long term, because you can certainly add another asset next year.
Bobby Marks is with us, former front office exec with the Nets, and now with The Vertical, and he has a great piece on the process of the draft. And, you just mentioned next year's draft could be a loaded draft. How is this year's draft being viewed in terms of the talent, and does that kind of go into play when you're making these decisions? All right, we know next year is going to be a lot bigger than this year, so we might not make that big-time deal like Philadelphia is being rumored to be a part of all over the place, because of all the stuff they have. Do they just say, you know what, we know next year's better, we have more assets, we'll use them next year?
Yeah, no, you're right. And we're going to put out a piece tomorrow night basically detailing what goes on the day of the draft and then the night of the draft. We kind of take a deep dive into it. And one of the things that I mentioned there is that you've got to control the chaos in the room. And what I mean by that is that you cannot get overwhelmed by the moment. If a team does call you and offers, pick 4 for next year, where you really got to, have a good balance as far as really keep your emotions in check and everything. So you certainly have to have that in play. I'm sure that's a discussion that teams are having right now with their personnel department, kind of laying out some type of mock draft for, not just this year, but also for next year in case a scenario is presented like that.
Bobby, you also have a section of the article that says medical psych and background, and I know you mentioned the word psych a few times, and what popped in my head is there's no Wonderlic test or anything like that for the NBA, right? I mean, so how do you determine if a guy's worthy or not, and how his mental makeup is?
Well, it's important. A lot of it is fit, and as far as chemistry in the locker room, and you're right. There is no, league-wide standard test and everything that can be done. It's up to every team to conduct their own personality assessment. Usually the case is, and we had this in Brooklyn, is that you always want a recommendation. You don't want a red flag. So you leave it on the GM's feet to make a decision as far as where that player grades out and everything. But it is part of the process. You can get some valuable information like that, similar to the background. But you don't want the psychologist or who is handling that to kind of be the overwhelming factor in that, unless there's really some red flags.
So how much of what we hear this week is agent-driven or team-driven? In other words, how much stock do you put into the trade talk?
Oh, I don't put much into it. Everyone is kind of positioning themselves, trying to, from an agent standpoint, this is one of the few times really where they dictate the process. As far as what we've seen with the draft workout, sending guys, to certain places. Trade talk is tricky. I know there is a market for, teams trying to obtain players that are under contract. We're going to see this cap spike to 94 this year, so there is a ton of value in those players, the Jimmy Butlers of the world, the Gordon Hayward of the world, who signed contracts under the old TV money and everything like that. But it's a lot challenging to make deals right now than maybe it was a couple of years ago.
Hey, Bobby, when you hear a situation of a player that might be out in the news that I don't want to play for that team, how much does the front office get scared off by that? If someone says when you were in New Jersey, hey, I don't want to go to New Jersey, do not take me, does that legitimately get taken under consideration? If Ben Simmons flat out said, look, Philadelphia, don't take me, how much stock gets put into something like that?
I think it's taken. There's more stock taken into it. If it's a player acquiring a trade that's under contract and maybe has another year, only 1 year left on it, I think that's it, because you don't want to, obtain a player and then lose them and give up some assets to do that. I think it's a little bit different when you have a draft pick. It's not like, the NFL was once where, you can have guys hold out. There's a structure to the contract. It's a 4-year contract. So I don't see it as being that big of a deal. It would raise a question if it's a player who is under contract going into the last year.
How about how much value you place on the second round?
A lot. I think you can find a lot of good value in there. You've got to make sure you've got the roster spots. Boston tomorrow night is going to be a tricky position because they've got 5 in the second round and everything. The second round, the undrafted, you've got to pay attention to players that go undrafted, because you can certainly find one, especially this year. Can you find a Kent Bazemore or a Dellavedova, one of those guys? There's been a lot of good guys in the second round also. Jordan Clarkson, who's a free agent this summer. So you'll see teams jockeying around, and teams have money at their disposal. Every team has close to $3 million, so you can probably buy your way in if you had to get something. But there is certainly value in the second round.
Yeah, you mentioned Boston has 8 overall picks, 5 in the second, 3 in the first. Philadelphia also has 3 first rounds. Now, how much different is it when you have picks 24 and 26? Because those guys get guaranteed deals. So is it tougher when you're at the back end of the draft, first round?
It is, because you've got to really have an eye on your own roster. So, I know with Philadelphia, they've got a bunch of guys on their non-guaranteed contracts. So you've got to weigh as far as if you're going to go to the European route and leave guys overseas with those picks, or can those picks those players you're drafting at those 2 picks, can they come in and take a job away from somebody? So you've got to weigh everything when you're looking at the back end, because it's a lot different than one. Now you're kind of at the mercy of the teams in front of you, with that. Or you can also go the route, can you package both picks and move up to the teams and maybe find a player that you might want there.
Craziest draft night experience for you being in a front office? What is something that happened when you were in the Nets front office that just was wild?
You know what, we had in 2001, we had agreed to a deal with Houston. It was the year we had traded, I think it was the 7th pick to Philly for, I think it was Eddie Griffin, and we had acquired 14, 17, I think, and 21, and that was the year we took Richard Jefferson and Jason Collins and everything. And right before we had agreed to the trade, Houston had gotten hit with like a major I don't know, hurricane or some type of storm that basically knocked the power out and their phones out and everything. So we were on the clock trying to do, and basically when you agree to a trade like that, you're picking for each other. So as far as the player and stuff, and we at the last minute, we were able to get the player that we wanted Houston to pick and everything to get it into the league office. So I would say that's probably the most challenging we had in as far as a draft night.
Bobby Marks, at Bobby Marks 42. He's a front office insider at The Vertical with 20 years of NBA experience with the New Jersey Brooklyn Nets and a former assistant GM out there. I'm assuming you work with our old buddy Billy King then.
I did. I did for 5 years. I did.
All right, back-to-back NBA Finals, as he just alluded to there as well. Bobby, appreciate the time. Great piece on the walk-up to this draft.
Thanks. Appreciate it, guys.